To understand the brutal reality of Neanderthal violence, we must first understand who they were and the world they inhabited. Neanderthals were not just another primitive species of early humans. They were one of the most successful hominids to ever walk the earth. They appeared in Eurasia around 400,000 years ago and thrived until approximately 40,000 years ago. Their existence overlapped with early Homo sapiens for thousands of years, and during that time, they adapted to some of the harshest environments ever faced by humankind. Unlike the common misconception that portrays them as mindless cavemen, Neanderthals were highly intelligent, resourceful, and socially complex. Fossil evidence and archaeological discoveries suggest that they crafted sophisticated tools, controlled fire, buried their dead, and even created symbolic art. Their brains were as large, if not slightly larger, than those of modern humans, indicating advanced cognitive abilities. They lived in small, close-knit groups, forming deep social bonds that helped them survive in an unforgiving world. Physically, Neanderthals were built for endurance and strength. Their stocky, muscular bodies were an adaptation to the freezing Ice Age climates of Europe and Asia. They had broad rib cages, shorter limbs, and thick bones, all of which contributed to their ability to withstand cold temperatures and engage in physically demanding activities, including hunting and, as evidence suggests, violent encounters. Their powerful grip and robust build made them formidable warriors and hunters, capable of taking down large prey such as mammoths, bison, and reindeer with little more than wooden spears tipped with stone. But despite their impressive survival skills, their world was brutal and unforgiving. The Ice Age was a time of scarcity, where food and resources were limited and competition was fierce. Every aspect of their existence revolved around survival, whether it was hunting, foraging, or defending their territory from rival groups. In such an environment, violence was not just a possibility, it was a way of life. One of the most fascinating aspects of Neanderthals is their relationship with early modern humans. Genetic evidence confirms that interbreeding occurred between the two species, with many people today carrying traces of Neanderthal DNA. But was this interaction always peaceful? Or did it involve violent clashes, competition for resources, and territorial disputes? These questions remain central to our understanding of Neanderthal behavior and their ultimate fate. The story of the Neanderthals is one of survival, adaptation, and conflict. They were not mindless brutes, but intelligent and resilient beings who navigated a world filled with danger. However, the evidence left behind in their bones, tools, and settlements reveals a darker reality, one where violence was an unavoidable part of their existence. Their place in human history is not just as our distant relatives, but as warriors of a forgotten age, shaped by the harsh and brutal world they called home. For many years, Neanderthals were depicted as unintelligent, primitive brutes, nothing more than savage cavemen who roamed the icy landscapes of prehistoric Europe. Early discoveries of Neanderthal skeletons, particularly in the 19th and early 20th centuries, led scientists to believe that they were less evolved than modern humans. This image was reinforced by outdated reconstructions that made them look ape-like, with hunched postures, vacant expressions, and an overall lack of sophistication. However, modern research and advances in archaeology, genetics, and anthropology have completely overturned this stereotype, revealing that Neanderthals were far more intelligent, social, and complex than we once believed. One of the biggest misconceptions about Neanderthals is that they were incapable of advanced thinking or culture. However, evidence suggests that they engaged in behaviors that required problem-solving, planning, and communication. They made and used specialized tools, including finely crafted stone weapons that show a deep understanding of materials and physics. Their ability to create fire, construct shelters, and tanned animal hides for clothing demonstrates a level of ingenuity that was once thought to be exclusive to Homo sapiens. Furthermore, Neanderthals were not solitary wanderers. They lived in small, close-knit groups, much like modern hunter-gatherer societies. These groups relied on cooperation to survive in the harsh Ice Age environment, where hunting large prey like mammoths and bison required coordinated strategies. They likely communicated using a form of spoken language, although the exact nature of their speech remains a subject of debate. Their brain structures suggest they had the capacity for complex vocalizations, meaning they could have had a form of language that helped them work together effectively. Another misconception is that Neanderthals were purely violent and lacked compassion. However, burial sites and fossil evidence suggest otherwise. Some Neanderthal remains show signs of serious injuries that had healed, which implies that others must have cared for them. A Neanderthal with a crippling arm injury or a severe head wound would not have survived alone in the wild. This suggests that Neanderthals took care of their sick and injured, much like modern humans do today. Burial sites with grave goods, such as tools and animal bones, indicate that they may have had spiritual or ritualistic beliefs. This level of symbolic thought challenges the idea that they were simple-minded beings with no emotional depth. Additionally, Neanderthals were not incapable of art and creativity. Although they did not leave behind as many paintings or carvings as early modern humans, some cave sites contain evidence of Neanderthal-created markings, ochre pigments, and even jewelry made from animal bones and shells. This suggests they had an appreciation for decoration and symbolism, which is a sign of cognitive sophistication. Despite these discoveries, the myth of the unintelligent Neanderthal persists, largely due to outdated depictions in popular culture. Many movies, books, and even early scientific interpretations reinforce the idea that they were primitive, unintelligent creatures doomed to extinction because they were inferior to Homo sapiens. But the reality is far more complex. Neanderthals were not evolutionary failures. They were highly adapted to their environment and survived for hundreds of thousands of years, far longer than modern civilizations have existed. Their extinction was not necessarily due to a lack of intelligence or adaptability, but may have resulted from competition with Homo sapiens, climate changes, and interbreeding, which eventually led to their genetic absorption rather than complete disappearance. The more we learn about them, the more we realize that Neanderthals were not so different from us. Their society, tools, and behaviors suggest that they were capable, intelligent beings who played a significant role in human history. Neanderthals lived during the Pleistocene epoch, a period dominated by harsh Ice Age conditions. Their environment was one of the most extreme ever faced by a human species, filled with freezing temperatures, towering glaciers, and a constantly shifting climate that made survival incredibly difficult. These conditions shaped every aspect of Neanderthal life, from their physical adaptations to their social structures, hunting techniques, and even their tendency toward violence. One of the defining characteristics of the Ice Age was the extreme cold. Unlike modern humans, who primarily evolved in the warm climates of Africa, Neanderthals adapted to the icy landscapes of Europe and Western Asia. Their bodies evolved specifically to endure the relentless cold. Stocky builds with short limbs reduced heat loss, while large nasal cavities helped warm the freezing air before it reached their lungs. Their bones were thick and strong, built to withstand the physical demands of a harsh and often violent world. Food was one of the greatest challenges Neanderthals faced. The Ice Age was a time of scarcity, where edible plants were limited, and hunting large animals was the primary means of survival. Neanderthals relied heavily on hunting big game such as mammoths, woolly rhinos, bison, and reindeer. These hunts were not easy. Armed with wooden spears tipped with stone, Neanderthals had to get dangerously close to their prey, often engaging in direct, close-quarters combat with powerful animals. Fossil evidence shows that many Neanderthal injuries were similar to those seen in modern rodeo riders, suggesting they frequently wrestled with large, dangerous creatures. The brutal environment also meant that Neanderthals were constantly competing for resources. Large predators like cave lions, hyenas, and saber-toothed cats roamed the landscape, posing a constant threat. But perhaps the greatest competition came from other Neanderthal groups and, later, early Homo sapiens. As the Ice Age landscape shifted, forcing populations to move in search of food and shelter, conflicts over hunting grounds and territories became inevitable. In a world where survival depended on securing enough resources, violence became a necessary part of life. Another major challenge was the unpredictability of the climate. Ice ages were not static. Temperatures fluctuated, glaciers advanced and retreated, and ecosystems changed rapidly. Neanderthals had to be highly adaptable, constantly adjusting their strategies for finding food, building shelter, and staying warm. Some evidence suggests they used animal hides for clothing, possibly sewing them together using bone needles, much like early modern humans. They likely built sturdy shelters out of wood and bones to protect themselves from the elements. Social cooperation was crucial for survival in such a hostile environment. Neanderthals lived in small groups, and every member played a role in the fight for survival. Children and the elderly were cared for, injuries were treated, and knowledge about hunting and survival was passed down through generations. Their ability to work together as a unit likely gave them an advantage in the wild, allowing them to thrive in some of the most challenging conditions on Earth. Despite their incredible adaptability, the Ice Age ultimately played a role in their decline. As the climate continued to change, modern humans arrived in Europe, bringing with them new tools, weapons, and strategies that may have given them a competitive edge. Some researchers believe that increasing environmental pressures forced Neanderthals into smaller, more isolated populations, making it harder for them to survive. Others argue that violent conflicts with Homo sapiens over dwindling resources contributed to their downfall. The unforgiving world of the Ice Age shaped the Neanderthals into resilient, strong, and highly skilled survivors. Every aspect of their lives, from their hunting techniques to their social structures, and even their physical appearance, was a direct result of the harsh environment they lived in. The Ice Age was not just a backdrop to their existence. It was the force that defined who they were and, ultimately, played a role in their mysterious disappearance from history. The story of Neanderthal life is written in their bones. Archaeological discoveries over the past century have provided compelling evidence that violence was a frequent part of their existence. Many Neanderthal skeletons show clear signs of traumatic injuries, deep skull fractures, broken bones, and weapon-inflicted wounds, all of which paint a grim picture of a species that lived in a world of constant danger and brutal encounters. These injuries offer us direct evidence of violent conflicts, both within their own groups and potentially with other species, including early Homo sapiens. One of the most famous examples of Neanderthal trauma is a skull found in Shanidar Cave, Iraq. The remains, known as Shanidar I, belong to a Neanderthal male who suffered multiple severe injuries over his lifetime. He had a crushed eye socket, which likely left him blind in one eye, and a deformed right arm, possibly due to a past break that never healed properly. Some researchers suggest these injuries were the result of hunting accidents, but others believe they could have been caused by violent confrontations with other Neanderthals or rival groups. The fact that he survived despite these injuries indicates that his group cared for him, but it also raises questions about the nature of his wounds. Were they purely accidental, or was there a history of interpersonal violence among Neanderthals? Another striking discovery comes from Saint-Césaire, France, where the skull of a Neanderthal showed evidence of a sharp blow to the head. The fracture appears to have been caused by a weapon, possibly a wooden or stone club. The nature of the injury suggests a deliberate attack rather than an accidental fall. Given that Neanderthals lived in small groups, this injury could indicate a conflict between rival clans or even violence within the same community. Similar patterns of head trauma have been found in other Neanderthal sites, suggesting that violent encounters were not isolated incidents, but rather a common part of their world. Further evidence comes from the El Sidrón cave in Spain, where Neanderthal remains were discovered with signs of cannibalism. The bones show cut marks and evidence of being broken open for marrow extraction, a clear indication that they were processed in the same way as animal remains. Whether this act of cannibalism was a result of starvation, ritualistic behavior, or warfare is still debated, but it undeniably suggests that violence and survival were deeply intertwined in Neanderthal life. Weapon-inflicted injuries are also present in the archaeological record. Some Neanderthal fossils show puncture wounds consistent with spears, indicating that they may have been attacked by other Neanderthals or by early Homo sapiens. Since Neanderthals primarily used thrusting spears, designed for close combat rather than long-range attacks, this suggests that their battles were brutal, up-close encounters. Unlike modern humans, who later developed projectile weapons like bows and arrows, Neanderthals likely fought at close range, leading to frequent hand-to-hand combat and a high risk of serious injury. The The frequency of injuries found in Neanderthal skeletons suggests that violence was not an occasional event, but a recurring part of their lives. Some injuries show signs of healing, meaning that many Neanderthals survived their wounds and continued to live with the scars of past battles. Others, however, were fatal, indicating that not all conflicts ended with survival. The presence of multiple healed fractures on some skeletons suggests that individuals experienced repeated episodes of violence, whether through hunting, territorial disputes, or personal conflicts. However, not all violence was necessarily between Neanderthals themselves. As Homo sapiens began to spread into Neanderthal territories around 50,000 years ago, competition for resources would have become more intense. Some researchers argue that Neanderthals and early modern humans may have engaged in direct conflict, as suggested by injuries that appear to be caused by weapons more commonly associated with Homo sapiens. Did these two species fight for dominance, or were these occasional clashes between small groups? The answer remains unclear, but the physical evidence strongly suggests that Neanderthals were no strangers to combat. Ultimately, the archaeological evidence points to a life filled with danger, where violent encounters were a part of everyday existence. Whether through hunting accidents, intergroup conflicts, or battles with rival species, Neanderthals bore the scars of a world that demanded strength, resilience, and the ability to fight for survival. Survival in the Ice Age was not just about hunting and finding shelter, it was also about defending what little one had. Neanderthals lived in a world where food was scarce, climate conditions were harsh, and competition for resources was fierce. In such an unforgiving environment, conflict between groups was inevitable. Whether fighting for hunting grounds, defending their caves, or engaging in personal disputes, Neanderthals likely experienced frequent and violent clashes with rival groups. These conflicts may have played a significant role in shaping their behavior, social structures, and, ultimately, their fate. Neanderthals lived in small, close-knit groups, often consisting of extended family members. These groups were highly dependent on the land, hunting large Ice Age animals like mammoths, bison, and reindeer. However, such resources were limited, and during harsh winters or periods of environmental change, food shortages could lead to desperate measures. When multiple groups found themselves competing for the same herds or access to vital resources, such as water sources, tensions would have escalated. In these situations, the only options were to either move to a new location or fight to defend what was theirs. Archaeological evidence supports the idea that Neanderthals engaged in territorial disputes. Many Neanderthal skeletons bear signs of blunt force trauma, skull fractures, and weapon-inflicted wounds. While some injuries may have resulted from hunting accidents, others suggest deliberate attacks, possibly from rival groups. The close-range nature of Neanderthal combat weapons, thrusting spears and clubs, suggests that these fights would have been up-close and brutal, with warriors grappling and striking each other in direct hand-to-hand combat. One of the key reasons for conflict would have been the control of caves and shelters. Neanderthals relied on caves for protection from the elements, as well as from predators such as cave lions and hyenas. A well-situated cave near a freshwater source or a good hunting area would have been highly valuable. If multiple groups sought the same shelter, violent confrontations could have erupted. Some caves show evidence of repeated human occupation, with layers of artifacts from different groups, suggesting that caves were frequently fought over or abandoned and later reclaimed. Weapons found at Neanderthal sites further support the idea of intergroup violence. Neanderthals crafted sharp stone-tipped spears, ideal for both hunting and combat. Unlike the long-range weapons of later Homo sapiens, Neanderthal weapons required them to get dangerously close to their targets. This means that if they engaged in battle, it would have been face-to-face, with each combatant striking, stabbing, and bludgeoning their opponents at close quarters. This brutal form of fighting would have led to frequent and severe injuries. Competition for resources wasn't limited to food and shelter. It may have extended to social factors as well. Some researchers speculate that Neanderthal groups could have raided each other for mates. Given that Neanderthals lived in small populations, finding genetically diverse partners would have been a challenge. If a neighboring group had women of reproductive age, rival males might have attempted to capture them. leading to violent encounters between competing groups. Intergroup violence may have intensified when early Homo sapiens arrived in Neanderthal territory. Both species occupied similar ecological niches, relied on similar food sources, and hunted using similar methods. As modern humans spread into Europe, Neanderthals may have found themselves increasingly pushed out of their traditional lands. The presence of Neanderthal skulls with puncture wounds suggests that some of them may have been killed by projectile weapons, an advantage that Homo sapiens had over their Neanderthal cousins. This could indicate direct warfare between the two species, with Neanderthals struggling to compete against the superior weaponry and tactics of their rivals. Despite their strength and resilience, Neanderthals were ultimately at a disadvantage in prolonged conflicts. Their small population size made it difficult to recover from repeated losses, and if a group lost too many hunters in battle, they could struggle to provide food for the rest of their members. Over time, as their numbers dwindled and Homo sapiens continued to expand, Neanderthals may have been gradually pushed into extinction, their lands overtaken by their more adaptable relatives. Ultimately, the evidence strongly suggests that Neanderthal life was marked by frequent conflicts. Whether fighting over food, shelter, or survival itself, these battles were an unavoidable part of their existence. Their world was one of constant struggle, where only the strongest and most strategic could hope to endure. Hunting was the foundation of Neanderthal survival. Unlike modern humans, who developed long-range weapons like bows and arrows, Neanderthals relied on close combat hunting techniques that placed them in direct confrontation with some of the most dangerous animals of the Ice Age. This high-risk hunting style not only exposed them to frequent injuries, but also shaped their physical build, behavior, and even their neurological adaptations. The dangers of this method contributed to the many skeletal injuries found in Neanderthal remains, suggesting that violence was not only a result of intergroup conflict, but also an unavoidable part of everyday survival. Neanderthals primarily hunted large Ice Age megafauna such as mammoths, woolly rhinos, bison, reindeer, and wild horses. These animals were powerful, fast, and highly dangerous, requiring precise tactics and teamwork to bring them down. Unlike Homo sapiens, who eventually mastered the art of using projectile weapons to hunt from a safe distance, Neanderthals relied on thrusting spears, heavy wooden weapons with sharpened stone tips that had to be driven into an animal at close range. This meant that they had to get dangerously near their prey, often engaging in direct physical struggles with animals that weighed several tons. Archaeological discoveries have confirmed the physical toll of this hunting strategy. Many Neanderthal skeletons bear injuries that mirror those seen in modern rodeo riders: deep fractures, dislocated joints, and signs of blunt force trauma consistent with being thrown or trampled by large animals. These wounds indicate that Neanderthals were frequently injured during hunts, and in many cases, they survived their injuries, suggesting that they were cared for by their communities. However, these injuries also reveal the extreme risks they faced daily, as even a minor wound could become fatal in the harsh Ice Age environment. Hunting in groups was essential for Neanderthals, and their ability to work together in coordinated attacks was one of their greatest strengths. Some researchers believe they used ambush tactics, hiding behind rocks or in dense vegetation before launching sudden, brutal attacks on unsuspecting prey. They may have also used natural features such as cliffs or ravines to trap animals, forcing them into tight spaces where they could be more easily killed. Despite these strategic approaches, hunting still required immense physical strength and courage, as Neanderthals had no choice but to engage in close-quarters combat with animals that could crush them in an instant. Neanderthal weaponry, while highly effective at short range, lacked the versatility of later human tools. Their spears, made from hardened wood and flint, were designed for thrusting rather than throwing, meaning that every successful hunt required physical proximity to the animal. This placed Neanderthal hunters in extreme danger, as a single miscalculation could result in being gored, trampled, or thrown by their prey. Some fossil evidence even suggests that Neanderthals suffered repeated injuries over their lifetimes, indicating that they frequently returned to the hunt despite past wounds. The need for physical proximity to their prey may have also influenced their muscular build. Neanderthals had an incredibly robust skeletal structure, with thick bones and powerful muscles, particularly in their arms and shoulders. This physique was essential for delivering the force needed to drive a spear into a thick-skinned mammoth or bison. Their grip strength was also significantly stronger than that of modern humans, likely a result of both genetic adaptation and the physical demands of their hunting lifestyle. In addition to spears, Neanderthals may have used other hunting tools such as wooden clubs, which could have been used to deliver crushing blows to weakened or trapped animals. Some archaeological sites suggest that they also relied on fire to drive animals out of hiding or to corral them into areas where they could be more easily killed. However, without the long-range capabilities of bows or atlatls, spear throwers, their hunts remained high-risk operations that frequently resulted in injury. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence for Neanderthal hunting techniques comes from La Côte de Saint-Brelade in modern-day Jersey, where researchers found evidence suggesting that Neanderthals drove mammoths off cliffs as a hunting strategy. This method, known as jump hunting, was an effective way to kill large animals without engaging in direct combat. However, it required precise coordination and planning, indicating that Neanderthals were capable of complex group strategies. Despite their mastery of close combat hunting, Neanderthals may have struggled to adapt when Homo sapiens arrived in Europe with more advanced weapons and hunting techniques. Early modern humans used throwing spears, which allowed them to hunt from a safer distance, reducing their risk of injury. This technological advantage may have contributed to the eventual decline of Neanderthals, as their physically demanding hunting style became less sustainable in the face of competition. Ultimately, Neanderthal hunting tactics were a double-edged sword. While their strength, strategy, and teamwork made them formidable hunters, the constant physical danger of their methods meant that injuries were inevitable. Their reliance on close-range combat shaped their bodies, their societies, and their survival strategies, but it also exposed them to levels of danger that may have contributed to their eventual disappearance. The Neanderthals were not just skilled hunters, they were also formidable warriors. Their world was one of constant danger, where survival often depended on physical strength and the ability to wield weapons with lethal efficiency. Whether facing large Ice Age predators, rival Neanderthal groups, or the encroaching threat of early Homo sapiens, they relied on an array of weapons designed for close-quarters combat. Unlike the long-range weaponry developed by later human societies, Neanderthal combat tools required direct engagement, making their battles particularly brutal and violent. Neanderthal weapons were primarily made from materials available in their environment, with wood, bone, and stone being the most common. The most iconic of these was the thrusting spear, a weapon designed for piercing flesh at close range. Unlike the projectile weapons of later humans, Neanderthal spears were heavy and built for stabbing rather than throwing. This meant that in both hunting and combat, Neanderthals had to get dangerously close to their target, engaging in face-to-face struggles that often resulted in serious injuries. The construction of Neanderthal spears reveals a deep understanding of toolmaking. They crafted long, sturdy shafts from hardwood such as yew and reinforced the tips with carefully knapped stone points. These points were often attached using natural adhesives like tree resin and sometimes secured further with sinew bindings. Such craftsmanship ensured that their spears were not only strong but also capable of penetrating thick animal hides, or the flesh of rival Neanderthals. The bones of Neanderthals tell a story of a life filled with hardship, danger, and survival against incredible odds. Unlike modern humans, who gradually developed tools and strategies to minimize physical risks, Neanderthals lived in a world where injuries were a constant reality. Their skeletal remains reveal a pattern of severe trauma, often comparable to injuries seen in professional rodeo riders today: broken bones, skull fractures, and deep wounds, many of which show signs of healing. This means that while Neanderthals endured frequent injuries, they also had the capacity to recover and care for one another. However, the high prevalence of these wounds provides crucial evidence that their daily lives were shaped by violence, whether from hunting, territorial disputes, or direct combat with others. One of the most striking aspects of Neanderthal injuries is how widespread they were across individuals. Almost every well-preserved Neanderthal skeleton shows some sign of trauma. For example, The famous Shanidar 1 skeleton from Iraq belonged to a Neanderthal who had suffered a crushed eye socket, partial paralysis, and a withered arm, likely due to past injuries. Yet he survived for years, suggesting that his group provided care and support. Similarly, the La Chapelle-aux-Saints skeleton from France belonged to an elderly Neanderthal with severe arthritis, missing teeth, and multiple healed fractures, indicating that he had lived well beyond the point of being able to hunt or gather food on his own. These cases suggest that Neanderthals had a strong social structure, where injured individuals were not abandoned, but were instead helped by their group. The causes of these injuries, however, raise important questions. While some were clearly the result of hunting accidents, such as broken ribs from being knocked down by a large animal, others suggest a more violent origin. Many Neanderthal skulls show signs of blunt force trauma, likely caused by club-like weapons or direct blows to the head. Some researchers believe that these injuries resulted from conflicts between Neanderthal groups, possibly over hunting grounds or access to resources. The fact that many of these wounds show signs of healing suggests that while violent encounters were common, they were not always fatal. Weapon-inflicted injuries provide further evidence of direct combat. Some Neanderthal remains exhibit puncture wounds consistent with spear attacks, suggesting that they fought both among themselves and possibly against early Homo sapiens. The Saint-Césaire Neanderthal from France had a healed skull fracture that appears to have been caused by a sharp weapon, indicating a deliberate attack rather than an accidental injury. This suggests that Neanderthals engaged in direct combat, whether against rival groups of their own kind or against invading Homo sapiens who were expanding into their territories. Neanderthals' thick bones and muscular builds may have helped them survive these injuries, but they also reflect the physically demanding nature of their lives. Their arms, particularly their dominant ones, show significant asymmetry, meaning they were using their weapons with great force, repeatedly over time. The constant use of thrusting spears and hand tools put immense strain on their bodies, and many Neanderthals carried old injuries throughout their lives. Some skeletons even show signs of multiple healed fractures, meaning that individuals experienced repeated traumas, but continued to survive, an indication of both their resilience and the harsh conditions they faced. One of the more gruesome aspects of Neanderthal injuries is the evidence of cannibalism found in some sites. At El Sidrón in Spain, Neanderthal bones show cut marks consistent with being butchered for meat. Similar signs of cannibalism have been found in other locations, such as Moulagursi in France. Whether this was due to extreme starvation, ritualistic practices, or violent raids between groups remains unclear, but it suggests that violence among Neanderthals sometimes escalated to the point of consuming their enemies or even members of their own group. Despite their resilience, the constant injuries and physically demanding lifestyle may have contributed to their eventual decline. The repeated toll of broken bones, head trauma, and infections would have made survival increasingly difficult, especially when competing with early modern humans who had developed more efficient hunting methods and medical care. The fact that Neanderthals lived in smaller, isolated populations also meant that each serious injury could weaken the group as a whole, reducing their ability to hunt, defend their territory, or reproduce successfully. The evidence of injuries and survival among Neanderthals paints a picture of a species that was incredibly tough, but also trapped in a cycle of violence and physical hardship. They endured wounds that would have been fatal to many other species, yet they persisted, adapting to the challenges of their environment. However, their reliance on close-range combat, both in hunting and in conflict, may have ultimately placed them at a disadvantage as the world around them changed. The bones of Neanderthals reveal a harsh and violent existence, with skull trauma and blunt force injuries appearing frequently in the fossil record. These wounds provide direct evidence of the dangers they faced, whether from hunting accidents, territorial fights, or interpersonal conflicts within their own groups. Unlike modern humans, who eventually developed ranged weapons and more organized combat strategies, Neanderthals engaged in close-quarter struggles, using heavy spears and clubs that required physical strength and direct confrontation. As a result, their skulls bear the scars of a life filled with violent encounters. One of the most striking aspects of Neanderthal skull trauma is the number of individuals who show signs of head injuries. Studies of Neanderthal remains from various sites across Europe and the Middle East have found a high frequency of healed and unhealed fractures to the skull and face. These injuries often appear on the front or side of the skull, indicating that the blows were received head-on, consistent with face-to-face combat. Unlike accidental falls, which tend to cause injuries in random locations, the patterns seen in Neanderthals suggest intentional violence, either from fighting members of their own species or from defending themselves against predators and rival groups. One of the most well-documented cases of skull trauma comes from the Shanidar cave in Iraq. Shanidar I, a Neanderthal male who lived around 45,000 years ago, had a massive wound above his left eye socket that likely left him blind in that eye. This injury, which had healed over time, suggests he survived for many years despite being partially disabled. The cause of this wound remains debated. Was it the result of a hunting accident, a brutal fight with another Neanderthal, or even an attack by early Homo sapiens? While the exact circumstances remain unknown, it is clear that Neanderthals endured severe injuries and still managed to survive, likely with the help of their social groups. Another famous case is the Saint-Césaire Neanderthal from France, whose skull shows a sharp-edged wound likely caused by a weapon. Unlike the Shanidar I injury, this wound appears to have been inflicted by a cutting tool, suggesting either an attack with a stone blade or an early Homo sapiens weapon. The fact that this individual survived the injury long enough for it to heal is significant. It means Neanderthals were capable of recovering from life-threatening wounds, possibly with the aid of others. However, it also highlights the violent world they lived in, where weapons were used not just for hunting but also for combat. Blunt force trauma was another common injury among Neanderthals, likely caused by club-like weapons. Many Neanderthal skulls show signs of depression fractures, where the bone was crushed inward by a heavy impact. These injuries resemble those seen in modern humans who have been struck with blunt objects, such as in battlefield injuries or violent fights. Given that Neanderthals lived in small groups, conflicts over resources, mates, or leadership could have turned violent, leading to brutal head injuries. Unlike long-range combat seen in later human societies, Neanderthals would have fought in a direct, physical manner, using their immense strength to overpower opponents. One of the key differences between Neanderthal skull trauma and that of early Homo sapiens is the frequency and severity of injuries. While both species experience violence, Neanderthals appear to have engaged in more physical, close-range encounters. Early modern humans, on the other hand, developed projectile weapons like spears and later bows, which allowed them to fight from a safer distance. This difference in combat style may have contributed to the eventual dominance of Homo sapiens over Neanderthals. Some researchers have suggested that Neanderthals may have had a higher pain tolerance or faster healing abilities, given the number of individuals who survived severe skull trauma. The thickness of Neanderthal skull bones may have provided some protection, reducing the likelihood of fatal brain injuries. However, repeated blows to the head would still have had long-term effects, potentially leading to cognitive impairment, personality changes, or a reduced ability to contribute to the group. In a survival-based society, where every member played a crucial role, these injuries could have weakened a group's overall effectiveness. The causes of Neanderthal skull injuries remain an area of ongoing study, but the evidence is clear. Violence was a defining part of their existence. Whether from hunting accidents, intergroup conflicts, or battles with rivals, Neanderthals lived in a world where head trauma was common, and survival often depended on physical resilience. The scars they carried reveal a species that was not only strong but also accustomed to a life of struggle, where every day was a fight for dominance, territory, and survival. The world of the Neanderthals was not just one of survival against the elements and fierce Ice Age predators. It was also a world of conflict between their own kind. Evidence from skeletal remains suggests that interpersonal violence was a frequent and brutal part of Neanderthal life, likely fueled by competition for resources, territorial disputes, and possibly social hierarchies within their groups. Unlike modern humans, who eventually developed complex social structures and methods of conflict resolution, Neanderthals seem to have settled disputes in a far more direct and violent manner. Their reliance on close-range weapons such as spears and clubs meant that these fights were often personal, bloody, and physically devastating. One of the strongest pieces of evidence for interpersonal violence among Neanderthals comes from the patterns of skull trauma found in their remains. Many Neanderthal skeletons bear signs of blunt force injuries to the head, suggesting that hand-to-hand combat or weapon-based fights were common. The wounds, often located on the front or side of the skull, indicate face-to-face confrontations rather than accidental falls or animal attacks. These injuries appear across multiple Neanderthal sites, reinforcing the idea that violence was a widespread part of their existence, rather than an isolated occurrence. In some cases, these injuries show signs of healing, meaning that the victims survived the attacks. This suggests that Neanderthals had some level of social care, where wounded individuals were helped by their group until they recovered. However, the fact that so many Neanderthals carried these injuries points to a society where physical conflict was a regular part of life. These fights may have been over hunting grounds, mates, leadership within a group, or even revenge for past conflicts. With limited resources and harsh environmental conditions, tensions between individuals or rival groups could have easily escalated into violent encounters. One fascinating aspect of Neanderthal violence is the possibility of organized group conflicts. Given that Neanderthals lived in small, close-knit groups, warfare in the modern sense was unlikely. However, skirmishes between rival bands may have occurred, especially when hunting territories overlapped. If two groups came into contact while tracking the same herd of mammoths or competing for access to a critical water source, aggression may have followed. In such cases, battles would not have been fought with strategy or tactics, but through raw physical strength and weapon-based combat. Weapons like wooden clubs, stone-tipped spears, and heavy hand axes would have been the primary tools of violence. Neanderthal clubs, made from hardened wood, could deliver devastating blows capable of fracturing skulls or breaking bones. Thrusting spears, designed for close-range stabbing, would have made lethal weapons in combat. Unlike Homo sapiens, who later developed throwing weapons, Neanderthals fought at arm's length, making their battles far more intense and personal. A particularly compelling case of interpersonal violence is the Saint-Césaire Neanderthal from France. This individual had a skull fracture caused by a sharp-edged weapon, possibly a stone blade. The injury is consistent with a deliberate attack, rather than an accidental injury, suggesting that Neanderthals sometimes fought using cutting weapons. The fact that this individual survived long enough for the wound to partially heal indicates that violent conflicts were not always fatal, and wounded fighters were sometimes able to recover and continue contributing to their group. Some researchers argue that Neanderthal violence may have been ritualistic in some cases, potentially tied to dominance struggles or initiation rites. Given their small social groups, maintaining order would have been critical. If a young male sought to challenge the leader of a group, combat may have been the primary way to establish dominance. These confrontations could have resulted in serious injuries, but they may have been an accepted part of Neanderthal society. Neanderthals may have also engaged in violent encounters with early Homo sapiens as they spread into Europe. The arrival of modern humans roughly 40,000 years ago placed Neanderthals in direct competition with a species that had superior weapons and more advanced social structures. Some Neanderthal injuries appear to have been inflicted by projectile weapons, something that Neanderthals themselves did not use. This suggests that they may have been attacked by early Homo sapiens, who had developed long-range hunting and combat techniques that gave them a tactical advantage. While Neanderthals were powerful and highly skilled in close combat, their inability to engage in ranged warfare may have ultimately worked against them. A confrontation between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens would have been heavily one-sided, with Neanderthals forced into melee combat while their rivals could strike from a safe distance. This, combined with competition for resources, could have led to a gradual decline in Neanderthal populations. Despite their violent existence, Neanderthals were not simply mindless brutes. Their capacity for social care, cooperation, and survival in such a hostile world suggests a level of intelligence and emotional depth. However, their way of resolving conflicts appears to have been far more physical and immediate than that of later human societies. Whether fighting within their own groups or against external threats, Neanderthals lived in a world where violence was a constant reality. As early Homo sapiens expanded into Europe and Asia, they encountered a formidable rival, the Neanderthals. For thousands of years, these two human species coexisted, competing for the same resources, hunting the same animals, and possibly even interacting socially. However, the relationship between them was not always peaceful. The archaeological record suggests that conflict between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens was a significant factor in the Neanderthal story, potentially contributing to their eventual extinction. The struggle for survival between these two species was not just a competition of intelligence and adaptability, but also one of physical combat and territorial disputes. Neanderthals had dominated Europe for over 200,000 years before Homo sapiens arrived. They were highly adapted to their environment, physically powerful, and well-equipped for survival in Ice Age conditions. However, the arrival of Homo sapiens roughly 40,000 years ago introduced a new challenge, one that Neanderthals may not have been prepared for. Unlike Neanderthals, who relied on close-range thrusting spears and clubs for hunting and combat, Homo sapiens had developed advanced projectile weapons, including throwing spears, atlatls, and possibly even early bows. This gave Homo sapiens a significant advantage in warfare, allowing them to attack from a safe distance while Neanderthals were forced into melee combat. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence for violent encounters between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens comes from the injuries found on Neanderthal remains. Some Neanderthal skeletons bear wounds that appear to have been caused by projectile weapons, wounds that match the type of injuries seen in later human warfare. The fact that Neanderthals did not use projectile weapons themselves suggests that these injuries were not from hunting accidents, but from attacks by Homo sapiens. If true, this would mean that Neanderthals were sometimes the victims of long-range assaults, where they had little opportunity to fight back effectively. Territorial disputes were likely a major cause of conflict between the two species. Neanderthals lived in small, scattered groups, which meant that they were vulnerable to being outnumbered by the growing population of Homo sapiens. As Homo sapiens expanded into Europe, they would have gradually displaced Neanderthals from their traditional hunting grounds. Given the scarcity of food during the Ice Age, competition for resources would have been fierce. Encounters between Neanderthal and Homo sapiens hunting parties may have quickly turned violent, with each side fighting to protect its access to food and shelter. The psychological and strategic differences between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens may have also played a role in these conflicts. Neanderthals, despite their intelligence, appear to have been less flexible in their behavior and social organization. They lived in smaller groups, relied on direct physical combat, and had a more limited ability to coordinate large-scale strategies. In contrast, Homo sapiens had a more complex social structure, allowing them to communicate over long distances, organize hunting parties with greater efficiency, and possibly even plan coordinated attacks against Neanderthals. This ability to form larger alliances may have given Homo sapiens the upper hand in conflicts. The possibility of direct warfare between the two species is a subject of ongoing debate, but some researchers believe that skirmishes between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens were common. If Homo sapiens viewed Neanderthals as competitors rather than potential allies, then they may have actively sought to drive them out of their territories. Neanderthals, in turn, may have resisted these incursions, leading to prolonged periods of violent conflict. Some archaeological sites show evidence of Neanderthal populations suddenly disappearing after Homo sapiens arrived, suggesting that these encounters may not have always ended peacefully. However, the relationship between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens was not purely one of conflict. There is evidence that the two species interbred, meaning that some interactions must have been peaceful. Genetic studies have shown that modern humans, especially those of European and Asian descent, carry traces of Neanderthal DNA, indicating that at least some Neanderthals and Homo sapiens formed close relationships. This raises an intriguing question. Were Neanderthals and Homo sapiens engaged in a long, drawn-out war, or was their relationship more complex, with moments of both violence and cooperation? One of the lasting mysteries of Neanderthal-Homo sapiens interactions is the extent to which direct conflict contributed to the Neanderthals' eventual extinction. While environmental changes and resource scarcity likely played a role, the competition with Homo sapiens may have been the decisive factor. The Neanderthals were already living in small populations, and even a few violent conflicts could have significantly reduced their numbers. If Homo sapiens systematically displaced them from key regions, Neanderthals may have been left with fewer and fewer options for survival. Some researchers have even speculated that Homo sapiens may have engaged in a form of prehistoric ethnic cleansing, where Neanderthals were deliberately pushed to the margins of their habitat until they could no longer sustain themselves. While there is no definitive evidence for such a systematic campaign, the rapid disappearance of Neanderthals in certain regions suggests that they were unable to compete effectively with their Homo sapiens counterparts. Ultimately, the interactions between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens were likely a mix of conflict, competition, and occasional cooperation. However, the overwhelming advantage of Homo sapiens in terms of numbers, technology, and strategy may have ensured that when violence did occur, it was often the Neanderthals who suffered the worst consequences. Among the most unsettling evidence of Neanderthal violence is the discovery of cannibalism at multiple archaeological sites. While modern humans often associate cannibalism with desperation and starvation, the patterns of butchered Neanderthal remains suggest that it may have been more than just a survival strategy. In some cases, Neanderthals appear to have engaged in systematic cannibalism, either out of necessity, as part of violent conflicts, or possibly even for ritualistic reasons. The presence of cut marks, smashed bones, and signs of intentional defleshing on Neanderthal remains paints a grim picture of a species that, at times, turned on its own kind. One of the most well-documented cases of Neanderthal cannibalism comes from the site of El Sidrón in Spain. Here, researchers uncovered the remains of at least 12 Neanderthal individuals, men, women, and children, who had been butchered in a manner identical to the way Neanderthals processed animal carcasses. Their bones bore cut marks from stone tools, indicating that the flesh had been carefully removed. Some bones were cracked open, likely to extract marrow, which was a highly nutritious food source. This was not a quick or careless act of scavenging, but a deliberate process, suggesting that these individuals were killed and consumed by other Neanderthals. The question remains, why did Neanderthals resort to cannibalism? One possible explanation is starvation. Neanderthals lived in an unforgiving Ice Age environment where food could become scarce. During periods of extreme cold or when large prey animals were unavailable, Neanderthals may have turned to the only available source of protein, each other. This kind of survival cannibalism has been seen in modern human history as well, in cases such as the Donner Party and the survivors of the Andes plane crash. If Neanderthal groups were cut off from food sources due to harsh winters or territorial conflicts, cannibalism may have been an act of last resort. However, the evidence suggests that not all Neanderthal cannibalism was purely for survival. At sites such as Moulagursi in France, Neanderthal bones show signs of processing similar to that seen in ritualistic human cannibalism in later cultures. This raises the possibility that Neanderthals engaged in cannibalism as part of social or spiritual practices. Some anthropologists speculate that Neanderthals, like some indigenous human groups, may have believed in absorbing the strength or spirit of their fallen enemies by consuming their remains. If true, this would suggest a complex and possibly violent social dynamic within Neanderthal communities. Cannibalism could have also been linked to warfare. If rival Neanderthal groups fought over resources or territory, the victors may have consumed the bodies of the defeated as an act of dominance. In some human societies, cannibalism has been used to humiliate enemies, sending a message that the victors held absolute power. If Neanderthals engaged in this practice, it would indicate a level of organized violence and intergroup rivalry that goes beyond simple survival struggles. Another chilling possibility is that Neanderthals may have practiced cannibalism within their own social groups, either due to social breakdown or as a response to extreme conditions. The presence of child remains among cannibalized Neanderthals is particularly disturbing, as it raises the question of whether weaker members of the group, such as the elderly, sick, or young, were sacrificed in times of extreme hardship. While this may seem horrifying by modern standards, in a world where survival was the only priority, it is possible that Neanderthals made brutal choices to ensure the survival of the strongest members of their groups. The discovery of burned Neanderthal bones at some sites suggests that cooking may have been involved in these acts of cannibalism. Whether this was done for practical reasons, such as making the meat easier to digest, or as part of a ritual remains unknown. Some researchers argue that the presence of fire in these contexts indicates a level of premeditation, meaning that these acts were not just spontaneous survival cannibalism, but may have had a cultural or symbolic significance. Despite the disturbing nature of these findings, cannibalism does not necessarily mean that Neanderthals were more violent or brutal than early Homo sapiens. In fact, evidence of cannibalism has been found in many ancient human cultures, suggesting that it was not unique to Neanderthals. However, the prevalence of cannibalism at multiple Neanderthal sites suggests that it was a recurring part of their history, whether as a desperate survival measure, a result of violent conflicts, or as a ritualistic practice. The presence of cannibalism in Neanderthal societies raises broader questions about their social structures and the pressures they faced. If Neanderthals resorted to eating their own kind, it suggests that they lived in an environment where survival was incredibly difficult and food scarcity was a constant threat. It also indicates that, unlike later human civilizations that developed complex laws and moral codes around violence, Neanderthals may have had a more primal approach to survival, where the line between predator and prey was sometimes blurred. While Neanderthal violence is often associated with interpersonal conflicts and warfare, there is another, often overlooked source of injuries: hunting accidents. Neanderthals were apex predators, relying on their physical strength, intelligence, and cooperation to hunt large Ice Age animals such as mammoths, woolly rhinos, bison, and reindeer. However, this way of life came with significant risks. The injuries found on Neanderthal skeletons reveal that hunting was not just a source of sustenance, but also a dangerous and sometimes deadly pursuit. Neanderthals primarily hunted using thrusting spears, which required them to get dangerously close to their prey. Unlike later Homo sapiens, who developed projectile weapons like the bow and arrow or atlatls, spear throwers, Neanderthals lacked long-range weapons. This meant that in order to bring down large, powerful animals, they had to engage in close-quarters combat, often in direct physical confrontation. This hunting method greatly increased the risk of serious injuries, as a wounded and enraged animal could easily retaliate. The skeletal remains of Neanderthals frequently show trauma consistent with injuries seen in modern rodeo riders: broken ribs, fractured skulls, and severe limb injuries. This suggests that Neanderthals often suffered blunt force trauma, likely from being struck, trampled, or gored by large animals. For example, a Neanderthal fossil from Shanidar Cave in Iraq shows signs of multiple healed fractures, including a crushed eye socket and a withered arm. This individual survived these injuries, indicating that Neanderthals took care of their wounded, but it also highlights how hazardous their lifestyle was. Some injuries may have been caused by group hunting strategies that placed individuals at great risk. Neanderthals likely used ambush techniques, hiding in strategic locations before lunging at their prey with spears. In some cases, they may have driven animals into natural traps, such as cliffs or narrow gorges, where they could be more easily killed. However, these tactics were not foolproof. A charging bison or an angry woolly rhino could quickly turn the tide, goring or trampling a hunter in the process. Given the limited medical knowledge of the time, even a broken leg or deep wound could become a fatal injury due to infection or blood loss. The dangers of hunting were not limited to the animals themselves. The Ice Age landscape was an unforgiving environment, full of natural hazards. Neanderthals often hunted in icy, rocky terrain where a single misstep could lead to a deadly fall. Avalanches, freezing temperatures, and treacherous river crossings added to the dangers. If a Neanderthal hunter was injured far from the safety of his group, survival would have been unlikely. Even if he managed to return, his injuries could render him unable to contribute to the group's survival, placing strain on the rest of the community. One of the most striking aspects of Neanderthal injuries is that many individuals show signs of repeated trauma. This suggests that hunting accidents were not rare, one-time occurrences, but rather a frequent part of their lives. Despite this, Some Neanderthals managed to survive multiple serious injuries, which indicates that their groups provided care and support for the wounded. This level of social cohesion is remarkable, as it suggests that Neanderthals did not simply abandon injured members, but instead tended to them until they healed. Interestingly, some researchers have proposed that Neanderthals may have developed certain rituals or traditions related to hunting injuries. If hunting accidents were common, Neanderthals might have viewed these experiences as an important part of their lives, possibly leading to the formation of stories, lessons, or even initiation rites for young hunters. Scars and injuries may have been seen as marks of experience and bravery, reinforcing social bonds within their groups. Despite their formidable hunting skills, Neanderthals were ultimately at the mercy of the animals they pursued. The dangers they faced while hunting were a constant threat, shaping their physical bodies, social behaviors, and survival strategies. Their reliance on close-range weapons meant that every hunt carried the risk of severe injury or death, making survival a daily battle against both the natural world and their own limitations. Neanderthals were built for power. Their skeletal remains reveal a species that was physically formidable, with stocky bodies, thick bones, and immense muscular strength. Compared to Homo sapiens, Neanderthals were shorter but far more robust, with wider chests, strong limbs, and an extremely powerful grip. This physical advantage made them exceptional hunters and survivalists, but in the context of violence, whether in hunting accidents, intergroup conflicts, or fights with Homo sapiens, was their strength always an advantage, or could it have also been a vulnerability? One of the most defining features of Neanderthals was their sheer brute force. Their bones were much thicker than those of modern humans, suggesting that their muscles were incredibly strong. Estimates suggest that an average Neanderthal male had 20 to 30% more muscle mass than a modern human, particularly in the arms and shoulders. This meant that Neanderthals were likely capable of delivering devastating blows in close combat, whether with their fists, clubs, or other weapons. Their superior grip strength would have allowed them to hold onto weapons with incredible force, making them dangerous opponents in any fight. In a one-on-one confrontation, a Neanderthal could likely overpower a Homo sapiens with raw strength alone. If two individuals were engaged in a wrestling-like struggle, the Neanderthals' physicality would give them a massive advantage. Their ability to withstand damage was also impressive. Many Neanderthal remains show evidence of healed fractures and trauma, suggesting that they could survive significant injuries and recover. This resilience would have made them difficult opponents, as they were not easily taken down even after suffering wounds that might incapacitate a weaker individual. However, their reliance on brute strength may have also been a drawback. While Neanderthals were incredibly powerful, their fighting style was likely based on close-quarters combat, which made them vulnerable to attacks from a distance. Unlike Homo sapiens, who developed projectile weapons such as throwing spears and later the bow and arrow, Neanderthals primarily used thrusting spears that required them to be near their target. This meant that if Homo sapiens engaged Neanderthals in battle, they could potentially weaken or kill them before they even got close enough to fight back. Another factor to consider is endurance versus power. While Neanderthals had immense strength, they may not have been as efficient at long-distance pursuits or sustained combat. Homo sapiens had leaner builds, better suited for endurance running and prolonged engagements. If conflicts between the two species involved prolonged chases or extended battles, Neanderthals may have struggled to keep up. This could have been a decisive disadvantage in intergroup conflicts or territorial disputes, where the ability to move quickly and adapt to changing battle conditions was essential. Neanderthals' strength also came at a cost in terms of energy consumption. Their muscular bodies required large amounts of food to sustain, meaning they had to hunt frequently and consume high-calorie diets. If food became scarce, whether due to climate change, competition with Homo sapiens, or other factors, Neanderthals would have struggled to maintain their physical advantages. A starving Neanderthal, no matter how strong, would have been at a disadvantage in any fight. This reliance on constant nourishment may have contributed to their decline, especially as Homo sapiens, with their more adaptable diets and hunting strategies, became more dominant. Another intriguing possibility is that Neanderthal combat styles may have been less strategic than those of Homo sapiens. Strength alone does not always determine the outcome of a fight. Tactics, coordination, and adaptability play crucial roles as well. Homo sapiens were skilled at working together in large groups, using coordinated attacks and possibly even setting traps for their enemies. If Neanderthals relied more on brute force and less on organized strategies, they may have been at a disadvantage in large-scale conflicts. Neanderthal skeletal injuries provide further evidence of their physical combat capabilities. Some remains show signs of blunt force trauma, possibly from club-like weapons, which suggests that they may have engaged in brutal hand-to-hand combat. However, the frequency of head and torso injuries also suggests that their fighting techniques may have left them exposed to attacks. If Neanderthals were accustomed to engaging in face-to-face combat, they might have been vulnerable to surprise attacks or long-range assaults from Homo sapiens. Despite their immense physical power, Neanderthals were not invincible. Their reliance on close-quarters combat, high energy demands, and potential limitations in strategic warfare may have made them vulnerable in certain situations. Strength was undoubtedly a defining feature of Neanderthal life, but in a rapidly changing world, where adaptability was just as important as raw power, it may not have been enough to secure their long-term survival. The disappearance of Neanderthals from the historical record has been one of the greatest mysteries in human evolution. For over 200,000 years, they thrived across Europe and parts of Asia, surviving through multiple ice ages, adapting to harsh environments, and proving themselves as capable hunters and survivors. Yet, around 40,000 years ago, they vanished, leaving behind only traces in the DNA of modern humans. While there are many theories regarding their extinction, ranging from climate change to disease, one possibility that cannot be ignored is that violence, particularly conflicts with Homo sapiens, played a crucial role in their downfall. One of the biggest challenges Neanderthals faced was the arrival of Homo sapiens into their territories. By the time Homo sapiens entered Europe roughly 45,000 years ago, Neanderthals were already living in small, isolated populations. This made them vulnerable to competition. The two species hunted the same animals, gathered similar plant resources, and likely sought out the same shelter locations. Given this overlap, clashes over territory and resources were almost inevitable. If conflicts between the two species were common, Neanderthals, with their lower population numbers, would have been at a severe disadvantage. Neanderthals lived in relatively small groups, typically no more than 20 to 30 individuals per band. Homo sapiens, on the other hand, had larger social networks that allowed them to form alliances and share information across greater distances. This ability to communicate over long distances meant that Homo sapiens could mobilize larger forces in times of conflict, while Neanderthals were more isolated. If Neanderthals were forced into direct battles, they may have been easily outnumbered, making it difficult for them to sustain prolonged conflicts. The archaeological evidence suggests that as Homo sapiens spread across Europe, Neanderthal populations rapidly declined. Some researchers believe that this was not a coincidence. While outright warfare between the two species is difficult to prove, the presence of Neanderthal injuries that appear to have been caused by projectile weapons suggests that violent encounters did occur. Unlike Neanderthals, who relied on close-range weapons like thrusting spears, Homo sapiens had developed long-range weapons such as throwing spears and possibly even early bows. This technological advantage would have allowed Homo sapiens to attack Neanderthals from a distance, reducing their ability to fight back effectively. Another factor that may have contributed to Neanderthal decline was their slower rate of reproduction. Neanderthal mothers had longer gestation periods and required more time to care for their children compared to Homo sapiens. This meant that if Neanderthal groups suffered heavy losses, whether from direct conflict, hunting accidents, or environmental factors, they would have had a harder time recovering their numbers. Even small-scale conflicts with Homo sapiens could have had a devastating long-term impact on Neanderthal populations, especially if reproductive-age males were frequently killed. Some researchers have proposed that Neanderthals may have been gradually pushed out of their traditional territories rather than wiped out in direct battles. If Homo sapiens occupied key hunting grounds and forced Neanderthals into less hospitable environments, this could have led to their slow decline. As food sources became scarcer and competition intensified, Neanderthals may have been left with fewer and fewer options for survival. Over time, isolated Neanderthal groups may have simply faded away, unable to sustain their populations. Interbreeding between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens also raises intriguing questions. Genetic evidence shows that modern non-African humans carry a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA, indicating that the two species did not always view each other as enemies. This suggests that, at least in some cases, Neanderthals and Homo sapiens interacted peacefully, forming relationships and even producing offspring. However, this very interbreeding may have contributed to the decline of Neanderthals. If Homo sapiens absorbed small Neanderthal populations through interbreeding, it could have led to the gradual disappearance of pure Neanderthal groups. Another theory suggests that Neanderthals may have suffered from a form of prehistoric ethnic cleansing, where Homo sapiens actively sought to eliminate them. While there is no direct evidence of large-scale massacres, the rapid disappearance of Neanderthals from the fossil record in certain regions suggests that they may have been violently displaced or even exterminated in some areas. If Homo sapiens viewed Neanderthals as competitors rather than potential allies, they may have engaged in systematic efforts to drive them out, whether through direct attacks or by cutting off their access to vital resources.